Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
AP reports Gabon's military leader is sworn in as head of state after ousting the president last week. The new leader was sworn in a week after ousting the president, whose family had ruled the Central African nation for more than 5 decades. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time, and his latest book is entitled Revolting Capital: Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, General Bryce Ngema took the oath in the presidential palace in front of a packed, boisterous room of government officials, military, and local leaders in Gabon's capital. He's the cousin of the ousted president, Ondimba, who served as a bodyguard to his late father and is head of the Republican Guard, an elite military unit. Dr. Horne, a couple of things. One, with the swearing in of the new leader, it seems as though the coup is gathering its strength and gathering its power. And what are we to make of the familiar relationship between the new president and the ousted president, the cousins?
Well, as I suggested on this program previously, I think it's incumbent upon analysts and commentators to begin to draw distinctions between and amongst these waves of regime changes. It's apparent that in Mali, in West Africa, that needs to be put in a different context than the regime change in Gabon. And I say that because, as you know, Mali has grown close to Moscow. The Malian leadership showed up in significant numbers for the St. Petersburg Russia-Africa summits. Russia vetoed at the United Nations enhanced sanctions pushed by the former colonial power that is France against Mali. Whereas with regard to Gabon, the silence from the North Atlantic powers with regard to this regime change has been definite. And perhaps they suspect something that a wider audience may not have noticed. That is to say that there are these stories about Mr. Ngema supposedly being related to the outgoing leader, Mr. Bongo Ondimba. I should also say that if you monitor West African press, they're replete with rumors. And as the lawyers might say, I don't accept these stories for the truth of the matter asserted, but certainly they reflect the state of mind, that is to say, skepticism in certain outlets. What I'm referring to are these stories that suggest that relatives of Mr. Bongo Ondimba may be close to the new regime, including, according to, actually, this is a French source, including, according to this French source, that Mr. Bongo Ondimba's spouse might have had a hand in the coup. I don't necessarily credit that. Other stories about his sister supposedly having a hand in the coup. But in any case, I think it's fair to call it a kind of palace coup. And also, you might have seen the video of the authorities, the new authorities, rifling through the possessions of the now deposed leader, finding barrel upon barrel of cash, millions and billions of dollars in currency, including local currency, all manner of currency. And obviously that's meant to disfigure the reputation already shredded of Mr. Bongo Ondimba. But in any case, once again, I think you have to set the Gabonese events to one side. When one considers these other regime changes, for example, in Niger, where it's apparent that France is unhappy, they are reputedly contemplating a military intervention in league with the Economic Community of West African States. Obviously, they're unhappy with events in Mali. And I think to step back for a moment, what we have to realize is that we can expect more of this kind of turmoil in Africa in particular, because the status quo is not sustainable. The status quo being various autocracies backed by the North Atlantic countries, as the North Atlantic countries plunder and pillage these nations of their resources, be it uranium in Niger or oil in Gabon, and that with the rise of the BRICS plus 6, speaking of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus the newly installed 6 members, you have an alternative to the North Atlantic hegemony. And that's going to be particularly important on the African continent, where South Africa is part of the BRICS. South Africa has embassies in virtually every African nation. South Africa in many ways is the ideological leader of the African continent. And if you stir all of those factors together, what you come up with is the roots, the seeds of a new international order. And you're beginning to get a glimpse of that new order with regard to what's going on in formerly French West Africa. And this makes it all the more important for analysts on this side of the Atlantic to be quite careful, because our challenges are going to become ever more tricky. I've been paying close and careful attention to recent reporting in the corporate media about Saudi Arabia. Now, as you know more than most, I'm a stern critic of that monarchy. But the North Atlantic countries are very upset with Saudi Arabia right now because they've joined the BRICS. They are aligned with Russia with regard to oil production. And so you may not see it as accidental that there have been a flood of negative articles about Saudi Arabia. Now, I think we should ride that wave. We should not rise to the fence, needless to say, of Prince MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, who in many ways is a tyrant and a despot. But I don't find it coincidental that there have been these stories about how Saudi border guards have been massacring Ethiopians. Of course, Ethiopia isn't yet another new member of the BRICS. So once again, we're going to be entering a new stage, which is going to make it more incumbent than ever for us to keep a steady and firm hand on the events of the day.
Let me ask you this. What do you think about the other rumors about the U.S. Looking at West Africa and thinking, maybe it's time for France to go and us to move in? That part of this, that maybe even the Gabon could have been the U.S. supplanting France, I've heard that discussion. What are your thoughts on it?
As you know, I've suggested as much myself. And just to give a little history, I could go earlier, but let's start in 1956 with the French-British-Israeli piratical attack on Nasser's Egypt over control of the Suez Canal. The United States called out that attack, leading France to draw the conclusion that it had to move away from Uncle Sam. We've talked about how when Senator John F. Kennedy, then seeking to run for president of the United States in 1960, began to condemn French imperialism in Algeria. That misled some to think that he was an anti-imperialist, but actually he was trying to elbow aside French interests in North Africa on behalf of U.S. interests. And there has been this de facto agreement between Washington and Paris that if Paris could keep the lid on, Washington would accede to this neo-colonial empire in Africa, but France cannot keep the lid on. The lid is being blown into smithereens, and Uncle Sam, under pressure from the BRICS, feels that France, which, by the way, as you know, made a failed attempt to join the BRICS, which I think was an attempt to wrong foot Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam has decided that France has to be pushed aside. And that may actually come to fruition. And once again, we should not object, to put it mildly, to France stepping aside. In fact, as a matter of fact, we should be in the vanguard of demanding that France evacuate Africa. But we should be clear that we do not necessarily see, that Uncle Sam should replace France in terms of being the neo-colonial maestro on the African continent.
And as we've talked about before, the United States did that with Vietnam in what at that point was French Indochina. So that's just another data point in terms of the United, and Haiti, of course, is another example of the United States stepping in behind France as a imperial force. Sudan's top general meets with South Sudan's president on the war. Sudan's top military general held talks in Juba yesterday with South Sudan's president on his second trip abroad since the war in his country started earlier this year. Your thoughts on where we are in Sudan and South Sudan?
It's a very difficult situation. As you know, the relationship between South Sudan and the larger Sudan has been star-crossed. South Sudan seceded from the larger Sudan about a decade or so ago. U.S. imperialism was supportive of that secession. Recall that a leader of the South Sudanese forces, speaking of John Garang, who, of course, was educated in Iowa, Grinnell College and Iowa State University, had basically tried to weld together the two Sudans. But then he died in a mysterious helicopter crash. And after that crash, you saw the rise of the current leader, Salva Kiir, who, by the way, as you may have noticed, wears a Texas cowboy hat in honor of George W. Bush, who he gives credit for ushering in South Sudanese independence. In any case, once again, we have to put this conflict in Sudan in a wider context, this being the conflict in part between Egypt, which is supporting one side, and the Gulf Arabs who are supporting another side. Once again, we progressive and radical forces on this side of the Atlantic should not only call for U.S. hands off Sudan, we should also demand that these other external forces butt out.
Lastly, we only got about a minute, but Niger's post-coup prime minister hopes for an agreement with ECOWAS. Your thoughts on that?
Niger is under pressure. It's landlocked, and there are sanctions on the regime cutting down electricity. Inflation is spiraling out of control. I understand that President Macron of France, who the Nigerians refer to contemptuously as macaroni, a sort of cheap dish. And he speaks to the ousted President Bazoum regularly. It's a very dire situation that's unfolding. Certainly, we should call for solidarity with Niger because I think objectively we need to group Niger with Mali more so than grouping Niger with the apparent palace coup in Gabon.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.